As I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, this celebration today is certainly a culmination of your effort of 3 days of walking and this very notion of pilgrimage that has such a long, rich tradition in our faith. And so, of course, the physical aspect of a pilgrimage, the actual journeying, reminds us of the bigger picture of the entirety of our lives. We consider ourselves to be a pilgrim people as we make our way through history toward that moment where we stand before the Lord. So we can think about pilgrimage in the sense of all of humanity, from the beginning, the creation of Adam and Eve, until the second coming of the Lord, and many stops along the way. And we can think about the pilgrimage of our whole lives. So whether or not we are still around at the end of time, when we come to the end of our journey, we stand before the Lord. And so we have our individual pilgrimage as well. And so moments of pilgrimage along the way, they help us to focus on this bigger picture. But as I was thinking about the idea of pilgrimage, looking at the readings we have for this Gaudete Sunday in Advent, I was struck by the need to reflect on the interior journey as well, the pilgrimage that happens within us. So it is a little different than the physical act of walking in a pilgrimage, even different than the physical passing of time that marks the history of an individual person. Because those parts of life, that physical movement, they happen. Years come and go, no matter what we do. But the interior journey, that's something that does not happen automatically. Something that we should reflect on, and something, fortunately for us, that we can understand more completely because of the rich spiritual theology of our faith. After many, many centuries of faithful people and great saints being raised up in the life of prayer, they have laid out for us how the pilgrim journey of the interior life typically goes. So there are a few steps that happen, and these are steps that we should be conscious of, but they are also steps that are laid out for us in an interesting way in our gospel today. So the first step of our internal pilgrimage, of our journey of faith, is an awareness. Until we awaken, in some sense, to the reality of God in our lives, then we take no steps. Even as the years go by, we can stay in place if we are unaware of the power of God at work in us. And so step number one is that awakening. The second step then, after we become aware of the presence of God, then we hear the invitation of God, the invitation to move closer to Him, to move ever more into the kingdom that He has prepared for us. But one of the first things that we notice in that second step when we try to move closer to the Lord is that we have these big obstacles in our way. And those obstacles we call sin. Those sins in our life that must be purged. And so this stage of the spiritual journey in our tradition is called the purgative way, the purging of those sins that are obstacles that prevent us from growing closer to the Lord. But just ridding ourselves of sin, engaging in this purgative way, that is not the end of the pilgrimage. There are additional steps. And what follows that purgative way is what is called an illuminative way, living more fully in the light of Christ. With effort, we can put sins behind us because we have the great gift of God's mercy. Part of the invitation of the Lord in identifying our sins is so that we can be reconciled from those sins. But the journey must continue because the Lord wants to shine a light in our path. And when sin becomes less of an obstacle, then we become more aware of all of the different aspects of life where God is operating. And in this illuminative part of our journey, we start recognizing and welcoming God shining a light in areas that otherwise we might not notice God. And so not just when we go to church, not just when we are doing good things, but in our work and among our friends and with our own families, we are looking for the light of Christ to guide us in this illuminative way. The final step is what is known as the unitive way. And so it is growing in such a way that because we allow the light of Christ to shine in us so completely, we live in a greater communion with the Lord, this unitive way, something that we can begin to taste on earth, but will only fully be lived when we are brought into the eternal life of God, that completion of the journey. And so just like we would say that Mass is the completion of a physical pilgrimage, heaven is the completion of our life pilgrimage. Now, these steps, they play out for us in a beautiful way in the readings for today. So in these days of Advent, we are given John the Baptist as a role model, the one chosen by God to prepare the way. And because of John's witness and example, the first step is starting to happen for people. They are awakening. There are people becoming aware that God is at work in a new way. They see something in John that tells them God is more present than I realized. And once they awaken, well, then they have this desire for more. They come to hear John preaching, and they ask him the question, what should we do? And what John does for them is identify the sins that are obstacles. It says tax collectors came to him and they asked, "Teacher, what should we do?" And he says, "Stop collecting more than what is prescribed." After the tax collectors, the soldiers come and say, "What should we do?" And he says, "Do not practice extortion. Do not falsely accuse anyone. Be satisfied with your wages. Notice the sin in your life, and then bring that to the mercy of God." So it's powerful to realize that this is one of the steps in the journey, but in today's gospel, it's also powerful to realize that it's not just a universal don't sin, but it's a more personalized awareness of your sin. The sin that was identified for the tax collectors is not the same as that identified for the soldiers. And so it is not the same for each one of us. Every single one of us in our journey of faith must come face to face with our sin. We might even need help identifying it as they did, but we should approach the Lord in this stage of desire with the powerful question of those who approached John the Baptist. What should I do? For all of us, there are different parts of the journey in which we find ourselves. It could be that we need to give attention to that awakening so we take more seriously the presence of God. It may be that we need to give more effort to the purging of what is sinful in our lives, confronting sin more directly in our lives, or even seeking the wise counsel of those who might help us see the sins that too often we might turn a blind eye to. But again, the purgative way is not the completion of the journey, and John does not treat it that way. When he tells them that they should stop committing these sins, he is inviting them to continue on to an even greater step. Because as they experience the power of God at work, as they awaken, as they experience the mercy of God, will they look at John and say, "You have done everything for us," and he says, "No." He says there is something greater. It is not enough that you have experienced this in your relationship with me. I point you now to the next step. I point you to the greater reality, the one who is coming after me, for whom I am not even worthy to untie his sandal. He is the one who will baptize with fire and the Spirit. And so he points to Jesus. And he points to that kind of relationship that embraces the fire and Spirit of Jesus. the kind of light that the Spirit provides guiding us in our life of faith. And then, as we give attention to this reality, as we invite the Lord into more and more areas, then we will experience at a deeper level the communion that He calls us to. When we gather for Mass and we receive the Eucharist, as we grow in this part of our journey, well, then we recognize the gift of the Eucharist as the nourishment that we need, as the renewal in the life of Christ that moves us forward. And so the interior pilgrimage of our lives, well, this is crucial if we are to take advantage of the idea of a pilgrimage, of the fact that the Lord gives us a church through which to guide us, that He gives us spiritual practices that can help us direct our attention to the right things and turn away from all that tends to distract us normally. Now, I would also want to mention that as we grow in our own journey of faith, as we experience a newer and deeper relationship with the Lord, one of the things that He always does is send us to other people. He never calls us into this journey alone. You make this pilgrimage as part of a people. There is a certain bond that forms as you walk together. And now as we celebrate together, we are never made for the life of the Lord alone, but always as part of the family of faith. And so part of our mission is that we become evangelizers. And it's important that we hear that mission to be evangelizers, but it's also important that we keep in mind as evangelizers this progression of faith, the pilgrimage that other people are on. Because one of the ways that we fail in our evangelizing is that we don't allow other people to be on earlier parts of the journey. We try to make them be where we want them to be on the journey. And we should pay attention. Remember, what's the first step? The awakening. If someone has not awakened to Christ, then you pointing out their sin is not going to lead them closer to Christ. It will lead them farther away from you as well. And so we must appreciate how this grows so that we can work to cultivate the awakening that then leads to the question, what must I do? I can't emphasize this enough, because we have a tendency not to wait until they say, what must I do? We have a tendency to say, this is what you should do. And so we must be more patient, because just like our journey goes through ups and downs, just like there are certain days where it's easier to progress than others, we have to allow the Spirit to prepare those that He is calling. And so we should help cultivate the awakening that leads to the question that is given to John the Baptist. We must approach the question of the purgative way with an eye toward how can it lead to a greater life with Christ. Then, the journey that we are on in these steps through our life, they will all better prepare us for the final destination, the true culmination of the pilgrimage of a life itself, so that the interior journey that we go on corresponds to the historical journey of our lives, and each step makes us more ready for the work of God as He works in our lives today and moves us toward life eternal. And so our prayer now is that this Eucharist may provide once again the nourishment we need, the strength that only God can give, so that we will recognize His presence and persevere well in our pilgrimage.